In 10 months of fighting at Verdun in 1916, the French and German armies fired approximately 40 million artillery shells at each other. That works out to roughly 130,000 shells every single day. One shell for every 2 square meters of the battlefield. The ground at Verdun was hit so many times, so consistently, so thoroughly, that it stopped being ground in any meaningful sense. It became something else, something that had no name before Verdun gave it one. And tonight, you are standing in it. Here is the part nobody tells you. You are not going to die from a bullet. Bullets were almost secondary at Verdun. You are going to die from the ground itself, but we will get to that. First, understand why this place exists at all. Because the man who designed what happened here did not design a battle. He designed a machine. His name was Erich von Falkenhayn, chief of the German General Staff, and in December 1915, he wrote a memorandum to Kaiser Wilhelm II that is one of the most coldly rational documents in the history of organized violence. Falkenhayn had looked at the war and reached a conclusion that almost no commander on either side was willing to state plainly. The war could not be won by taking territory. It could only be won by destroying the enemy's ability and willingness to fight. And France, he argued, had one place it could never abandon, regardless of the military logic. One place so bound to French national identity that it would feed every man it had into the defense of it rather than retreat. That place was Verdun, an ancient fortress city on the Meuse River that had never fallen to a German army in recorded history. Falkenhayn's plan was not to capture Verdun. His plan was to use Verdun as a trap, to bleed France white. His exact words in the memorandum were that France must be bled white. He intended to make the cost of defending Verdun so catastrophic that France would collapse as a military power, regardless of whether the fortress itself changed hands. He was building a killing machine disguised as a battle, and it worked on both sides simultaneously, which was not entirely what he had planned. Now picture where you are standing. The Verdun salient is a bulge in the French lines, roughly 15 kilometers deep and 20 kilometers wide. To the north, the German lines. To every other direction, French territory. The terrain is the Meuse Hills, rolling ground that in peacetime was farmland and forest. By the time you arrive in the summer of 1916, none of that remains. What the artillery has left behind is a landscape that soldiers on both sides described with the same word, regardless of which language they used. They called it the moon. Craters overlapping craters, the rims of one shell hole forming the floor of the next, stretching in every direction to the horizon. No trees, no grass, no landmarks. Nothing vertical except the occasional splintered stump, rising a meter from the crater floor before it too gets hit and disappears. The soil itself has been pulverized to a fine powder that mixes with rain into a gray mud of a specific consistency that veterans described as having no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. It is not the mud of a riverbank or a plowed field. It is ground that has been explosively processed tens of thousands of times until it has lost all structural integrity. Men sink into it. Animals sink into it. Equipment sinks into it. Things that sink into Verdun mud do not always come back up. Here is the detail that the history books mention briefly and then move past, and you should not move past it. The mud at Verdun contained the liquefied remains of human beings. By the summer of 1916, so many men had been killed and incompletely buried, and then killed again by subsequent shelling, and scattered and buried again, and scattered again, that the soil was chemically different from normal earth. Soldiers reported that the mud smelled differently from any other mud they had encountered. They reported finding pieces of men mixed into the walls of shell craters they were digging into for shelter. A French soldier named Henri Barbousse who survived Verdun and wrote about it, described scraping out a sleeping space in a crater wall and finding a human hand protruding from the earth as naturally as a root. He left it there because removing it would have meant touching it, and because in any case there was nowhere else to sleep. That is the texture of the ground you are living in. Now, add the gas. Because the artillery at Verdun did not only fire high explosive, both sides used chemical shells throughout the battle. And the gas at Verdun behaved differently from gas in other sectors because of the terrain. Phosgene and chlorine settled into the shell craters, the lowest points of the landscape, which were also the only available shelter, were also the places where gas pooled and concentrated. Men who dove into a crater to escape shrapnel sometimes dove into a pocket of gas that had settled there hours before and was still sitting at lethal concentration. The crater that saved you from one shell could kill you with the legacy of a shell fired yesterday. Soldiers learned to check craters before entering them, which meant pausing in the open while under fire in order to smell the air of potential shelter before committing to it. The ones who did not learn this did not write about Verdun afterward. You have been at the front for 6 days. You arrived as part of the French system called La Nymphe, the rotating relief system that General Pétain designed specifically for Verdun. Pétain had understood early that no unit could be left in the Verdun sector for extended periods without ceasing to function as a military force. So he rotated divisions in and out continuously. Approximately 70% of the entire French army served at Verdun at some point during the battle. This means that Verdun was not a battle that happened to French soldiers. Verdun was something that happened to France. Almost every family in France had someone who went through it. But right now, in this moment, the rotation system means nothing to you, because you are on day 6 of what was supposed to be a 4-day rotation, and the unit you are waiting to relieve you has not arrived, and no one can tell you when it will, because the road behind you, the voie sacrée, the sacred way, is under artillery interdiction, and the relief column cannot move until dark, and dark is still 4 hours away. The voie sacrée deserves a moment of explanation, because it is the reason Verdun held at all, and because nothing like it had existed before, and nothing quite like it has existed since. A single secondary road, Bar-le-Duc to Verdun, 56 kilometers long, was the only supply route into the fortress that German artillery could not completely interdict. Pétain organized it into a continuous convoy system that operated 24 hours a day without stopping. At its peak, a truck passed a given point on the road every 14 seconds. The road had maintenance crews working on it continuously because the weight of traffic destroyed the surface faster than normal repair could address it, and so they crushed local quarry stone and spread it under the moving wheels in real time, essentially building the road as the trucks drove on it. 6,000 trucks, 190,000 men, and 23,000 tons of supplies moved along it every single week. If the road had failed, Verdun would have fallen within days. The road did not fail. But you, waiting in a shell crater on day 6 of a 4-day rotation, are not thinking about the voie sacrée. You are thinking about the sound. The sound at Verdun was unlike anything that had existed in the world before artillery reached this scale. Veterans who survived it and lived to old age reported that the sound never fully left them, not as memory, as a physical sensation that recurred without warning for the rest of their lives. The bombardment at Verdun's peak was loud enough to be heard in London, not as a rumble, as a distinct, identifiable sound. Across the English Channel, civilians reported hearing it and understanding what it was. At the source, at the front line where you are sitting, the sound was something that the human auditory system was not designed to process at that volume and that duration. Men went deaf. Temporary deafness from concussion was so common, it was not treated as a medical condition. Men went temporarily blind from concussive pressure. Men lost the ability to speak, not from psychological trauma, though that existed too, but from the physical effect of sustained overpressure on the larynx and nervous system. The French medical term was obus shock, shell shock, in the literal physical sense, and the Verdun sector produced cases of it in numbers that overwhelmed the medical system's capacity to categorize them, let alone treat them. On February 21st, 1916, the opening day of the battle, the Germans fired 100,000 shells in the first hour alone. 100,000 shells in 60 minutes. The French front line, a series of trenches and fortified positions, simply ceased to exist across most of its length. Units that had been in place were not pushed back. They were erased. Survivors emerged from the rubble, not knowing what direction they were facing, because every landmark had been removed, and the smoke and dust had made the sky directionless. German infantry advancing behind the barrage found French soldiers who were alive, but completely unresponsive, sitting in rubble, not able to answer questions or follow instructions, not wounded in any visible way, simply no longer present in any functional sense. The opening bombardment had removed them from themselves. Here is the moment that the battle turned into something different from any battle before it. 3 days after the opening bombardment, on February 25th, a single German unit advancing through the chaos reached Fort Douaumont, the largest and most heavily fortified position in the entire Verdun defensive system. A fort that the French military had assessed as capable of withstanding any conceivable assault. And they took it. Not with a massive assault, not with engineering and planning. Sergeant Kunze of the 24th Brandenburg Regiment entered the fort with a small patrol, found the interior defended by a skeleton crew of maybe 50 men, and took it almost without firing a shot. The garrison was inadequate because French command had stripped the permanent garrisons from the Verdun forts earlier in the war, on the theory that static fortifications were obsolete in modern warfare. The theory was wrong. The strongest fortress on the Western Front fell to a sergeant and a patrol. The fall of Douaumont is what you need to understand about the psychology of the French army at Verdun, because it is what created the political and emotional pressure that Falkenhayn had calculated. France could not lose Douaumont. France could not be seen to lose Douaumont. Every political and military decision from that point forward was shaped by the necessity of taking it back, and the French army attacked it repeatedly through the spring and summer, pouring men into assaults that the German garrison, now properly reinforced, repelled with the same artillery and machine gun logic that governed every other operation at Verdun. The French eventually retook Douaumont in October. They lost more men retaking it than the Germans had lost defending it. Now it is night. You have survived day 6. The relief column arrived just before midnight, and you have moved back from the forward position to a secondary trench that is marginally more sheltered, which means that the shrapnel density is slightly lower and the gas risk is slightly reduced, and you are still completely exposed to direct artillery fire, because there is no position at Verdun that is not exposed to direct artillery fire. You are going to try to sleep. This is what sleep at Verdun looked like. You find the driest section of trench wall you can locate. You sit with your back against it. You pull your coat around you. The temperature in the Meuse hills at night in summer is cool enough to be uncomfortable, and in winter, cold enough to be dangerous. And you are wet, because the rain at Verdun is constant, and the mud holds moisture against every surface it touches. You close your eyes. The artillery does not stop. It never stops at Verdun. There is no quiet period, no designated nighttime reduction in firing, no pause that your nervous system can use to begin recovering from the day. The shells come in patterns that your brain, despite everything, tries to analyze and predict, because that is what brains do. And the patterns are random, which means your brain runs its prediction algorithm continuously on data that has no pattern, which means you do not sleep. You achieve something between unconsciousness and awareness that lasts in intervals of minutes. And during those intervals, your body generates the minimum maintenance it needs to continue functioning. And in the morning, you are less rested than you were when you tried to sleep. But you are still alive, and that distinction from the men who did not survive the night is the only distinction that has any operational meaning. Sergeant Marc Boisson of the French 155th Infantry wrote home in June 1916, describing a night in the Verdun sector. He wrote that he had found a shell crater deep enough to offer some protection, and had lain down in it, and that the walls of the crater were warm. He initially took comfort from this. Then he understood why the walls were warm. The decomposing organic material in the soil of Verdun generated heat through bacterial action. The warmth in the crater walls was the warmth of decomposition. He wrote that he lay in it anyway, because there was nowhere else to lie, and because he was too tired to feel what he knew he should feel about it. He survived Verdun. Most of his unit did not. The battle produced something that had not been seen before in industrial warfare, and has not been seen in the same form since. A specific category of casualty that the French called the disparus, the disappeared. Men who were present at one moment and absent the next, with no body, no witness, no explanation. The artillery at Verdun fired with enough density and enough explosive yield that a direct hit on a man left nothing recoverable. Not a wound, not a body, nothing. Statistically, approximately 70,000 French soldiers who died at Verdun have no identified grave because there was nothing to bury. They are in the ground. They are the ground. The Douaumont ossuary, built after the war to hold the recovered remains, contains the bones of approximately 130,000 unidentified soldiers, visible through windows in its base. Unidentified because the remains of different men were so thoroughly mixed by the continuous shelling that individual identification was impossible. The ossuary does not contain burials. It contains the material evidence of what happens when artillery operates at Verdun scale on human bodies over 10 months. By the time the battle officially ended in December 1916, the total casualties on both sides reached approximately 700,000. Some estimates go higher. The territorial result was essentially zero. The front line at the end of December 1916 was within a few kilometers of where it had been at the start of February. Falkenhayn's bleeding machine had worked. It had bled both sides at roughly equal rates, which was not the outcome he had calculated, and he was relieved of command in August 1916, while the machine he had designed continued running without him. The forest that existed before the battle has never fully returned. The Verdun battlefield today contains a zone rouge, a red zone, land declared permanently uninhabitable because the concentration of unexploded ordnance, human remains, and chemical agent residue in the soil makes it impossible to safely develop or farm. The zone covers approximately 100 square kilometers. Foresters planted pine trees across much of it in the 1920s because pines are among the few species that grow in soil with a specific chemical composition that Verdun produced. The trees grow in straight lines because they were planted that way, and they grow in soil that still yields human bones and unexploded shells with every significant storm. The ground is still giving them back. A century later, the ground is still giving them back. You would not have lasted one night, not because of any individual failure of courage or endurance, Because the thing at Verdun was not designed to be survived. It was designed by a general who had decided that the purpose of battle was consumption, and it consumed everything that entered it with a thoroughness and an impartiality that made individual survival largely a function of where you happened to be standing when a specific shell with a specific trajectory arrived at a specific point. The men who survived Verdun were not tougher than the men who did not. They were luckier. And the difference between the lucky ones and the unlucky ones was measured in meters and milliseconds, and the essentially random distribution of 40 million shells across 30 square kilometers over 300 days. If this kept you watching until the end, then you already understand something that most people who hear the word Verdun do not. It was not a battle in the way that word normally implies human decision and human agency and the possibility of human outcome. It was a machine. Falkenhayn built it. Both sides fed it, and it ran until it ran out of the year. Leave a comment below telling me which single fact about Verdun changed how you understood it. The answers are always more specific than I expect, and they always tell me what the next video should be. If this one reached you, pass it to someone who would sit with it. EOF.